was already drying at the corner of my mouth when my stepbrother crouched down to my level, close enough that I could smell the coffee on his breath, and told me I had until the end of the day to sign or I'd lose everything. I was on the floor of a hospital corridor, not a patient, a visitor. My dad had been dead for maybe 4 hours, and the pen my stepbrother was holding out to me was the same cheap blue kind we kept in a coffee can by the register at the restaurant, and I remember thinking, even with my ear ringing from where he'd hit me, how strange it was that a man could murder his own stepfather and still use the lousy free pens. "Choose," he said. "You can do this the easy way and walk out with something, or you can be stubborn and walk out with nothing. Your call." A nurse I didn't know was already on the phone with security. 2 visitors had backed against the wall like they'd seen a snake. My stepbrother stood up, smoothed his shirt, and put on the face I'd watched him use my whole life, the reasonable one. The one that said, "Poor thing, she's grieving, she doesn't know what she's saying." But it's hard to talk your way out of a woman bleeding on the floor of a cardiac unit. I knew that now. I didn't know much of anything that morning. My name is Maren. I'm 30 years old, and I'm an ICU nurse, which matters more to this story than it should. I spent 8 years learning how the human body fails, how to read the slow, quiet way a person slips under, and I still didn't see what was happening to my own father until it was already done. That's the part I can't forgive myself for, even now. My dad built Whitlocks from a single roadside smoker off Route 11 outside Knoxville. He started it the year my mother died. I was 6, because he said he couldn't sit still in a quiet house anymore. By the time I was in high school, it was 3 locations. By the time he died, it was 9, plus the catering arm, plus the sauce that ended up on grocery shelves across 4 states. A little over $12 million, the accountant said later, though my dad never once said a number out loud in his life. He said things like, "Take care of the people who take care of you." He paid for line cooks' kids to get braces. He kept a pitmaster named Otis on payroll through a year of chemo without docking an hour. He was, and I mean this plainly, the best man I ever knew, and he raised me by himself with flour on his apron and a paperback in his back pocket, and 3 years before any of this, he married a woman who killed him for his money. I should back up. He met her at a charity thing for the Children's Hospital. She was elegant in a way our family was not. Silk scarves, a low laugh, a way of touching your forearm when she talked that made you feel chosen. My stepmother. She had a grown son from a previous marriage, my stepbrother, who came as part of the package and slid himself into the business within the year. CFO, he called himself, though my dad just called him the numbers fella and never quite trusted him, I think. The way you don't trust a dog that smiles. I was busy. I was working nights at the hospital. I told myself it was good that Dad had company. I told myself a lot of things. He had a bad heart and type 2 diabetes, both well managed for years. Then, about 6 months before he died, things started to wobble. Sugar crashes that didn't make sense. Confusion. Falls. Twice he ended up in the ER shaking and sweating with a blood glucose in the 30s, and twice his own doctor scratched his head and adjusted the insulin and sent him home, and twice it happened again. I remember sitting in the cafeteria with my dad's chart pulled up on my phone, frowning at numbers that wouldn't behave, and I remember my stepbrother appearing at my elbow saying, "The nurse thinks she's a doctor now," and laughing and me letting it go because I was tired and he was family. He died on a Tuesday. By Tuesday afternoon, I was on the floor. Here's how it went after the slap. Security came, my stepbrother turned charming, the police came, and because there were witnesses and a handprint already blooming on my cheek, they arrested him. My stepmother bailed him out before dinner. By the time my friend drove me back to my dad's house that night, I was too rattled to drive. The locks were changed and my things were in the front yard. Not packed. Dumped. Clothes in the wet grass because the sprinklers had run. My nursing textbooks swollen and ruined. And in the middle of the driveway, smashed, the little cedar box that held my mother's things. The only things of hers I had. A string of freshwater pearls my dad gave her on an anniversary she didn't live to see again was strewn across the concrete, and I sat down right there in the dark and picked them up one at a time, and that, more than the slap, more than my dad being gone, is the moment something in me went cold. and stayed cold. The friend who drove me was a woman named Birdie, 71 years old, 4'11", kept the books for my dad's restaurants for almost 20 years before she retired, which mostly meant she came in 3 days a week instead of 5 and yelled at the produce vendors from a stool. She was a forensic auditor for the IRS before any of us were born. She has reading glasses on a beaded chain and a handbag that could stop a truck. She took one look at me holding those pearls and said, very quietly, "Honey, your daddy would have burned the world down before he let this happen. So either the world's gone crazy or somebody's lying. And I have never in my life met a liar. I couldn't outmath." That sentence is the only reason I'm here to tell you the rest of it. I slept on her couch. The next day my stepbrother came by, all smiles, leaning in her doorway like he'd been invited. He said the neighborhood was getting rough. He said maybe I'd be more comfortable starting fresh somewhere else, another state even. Birdie didn't even look up from her crossword. She said, "I knew you when you were stealing quarters out of the church collection plate, so don't come into my house and play businessman." He left. That night somebody put a rock through her kitchen window with a note, rubber banded around it that said, "Keep your nose out of it," and the next morning there was a single word spray painted on her garage in red. I won't write it. It was the kind of word a man uses when he's run out of other tools. That's the moment Birdie pulled out her laptop and stopped being sweet. She still had her old login to the restaurant's accounting system. My dad changed his sauce recipe more often than his passwords. God love him. And what she found over the next 2 days, hunched at her kitchen table with a pot of coffee and her glasses slipping down her nose, made me physically sick. My stepbrother had been bleeding the company for years. Not all at once, he was smarter than that. Or at least more patient. Vendor invoices for deliveries that never came. A marketing consultancy registered to a P.O. box that turned out to be his. Peril for 2 employees who had never set foot in a kitchen. Catering jobs that were billed, paid, and then quietly refunded to an account that wasn't ours. Line by line, year by year. Close to $500,000 in the last 12 months alone. And it accelerated. This is the part that made Birdie go still. It accelerated right around the time my dad's health fell apart. "Maren," she said. And she never called me Maren. It was always honey or kiddo. "When did your daddy's sugar start dropping?" I told her, 6 months, right about then. She took her glasses off and rubbed her eyes and said the thing I'd been refusing to think since the hospital. "Sweetheart, I've seen this before. Not the books, the other part, a relative who can't wait." I'm a nurse. I knew, the second she said it, exactly how you do it to a diabetic and make it look like nature. You wouldn't even need the prescription pills. You'd just give him insulin. He didn't need a few extra units in the morning. A man his age, a bad heart, and the crashes look like the disease getting worse. Slow enough to be tragic. Fast enough to be useful. And the body clears it. By the time anyone thinks to test, it's gone. But not entirely. There's a test. C-peptide. Your own pancreas makes insulin and C-peptide together, in lockstep. Inject insulin from outside, and you get high insulin with low C-peptide, a fingerprint that doesn't belong to any natural disease. If anyone had drawn that panel during one of his crashes, they'd have seen it screaming. I checked his chart again. Nobody had ordered it. Except, and my hands actually shook, at his very last admission, a hospitalist had. A doctor named Vance, new, thorough, had flagged the numbers as atypical, recommend endocrine workup. The note was there. The workup never happened. My dad coded before the labs came back. I want to tell you, I marched straight to the police. I didn't. I sat on Birdie's couch and cried for an hour because the map was telling me my father had been murdered in front of me by inches for half a year while I sat in the cafeteria frowning at his chart, and I had let a man call me the nurse who thinks she's a doctor, and I had let it go. Birdie let me cry. Then she said, "Now, your daddy was no fool. If he got scared, and a scared man gets careful, he'd have left something. Where'd that man keep what mattered?" And I remembered the last thing he ever said to me with his real voice, 2 days before the end, when I leaned over his bed and he gripped my wrist hard enough to bruise and said, "The smoker." The old one out back, underneath. The day your mother and I opened the stand, I'd thought it was the confusion talking. The first restaurant, the original roadside smoker, was rusting under a tarp behind the flagship location, decommissioned for a decade. He'd kept it for sentiment. I thought he was wandering. He wasn't. He was telling me where the bodies were buried, except it was the opposite. He was telling me where the truth was. They'd changed the locks on the house, but the restaurant lot was still ours on paper until the estate cleared. 2 nights later, Birdie and I drove out there at midnight with a flashlight and a crowbar. 2 women, one of them 71, breaking into a barbecue joint we technically owned. Under the old smoker, welded into a hollow in the firebox where no one would ever clean, was a steel box. The combination, scratched on the inside of my arm in pen so I wouldn't forget, was the date the stand opened. It worked on the first try. 3 things were inside. The first was my dad's real will, notarized, dated 5 weeks before he died, leaving the business split between me and a trust for the employees' profit sharing, with a fixed sum and the Florida condo going to my stepmother and stepbrother. Fair, the way he was always fair, even to people who didn't deserve it. The second was a folder an inch thick. My dad had hired an outside forensic accountant, quietly, without telling anyone in the office, and the report laid out my stepbrother's theft in a way even I could follow, with a sticky note on the front in his handwriting that said from Maren, "If I'm gone." The third was a letter, and I'm not going to pretend I can write about it without my throat closing. He knew. That's what the letter said. He knew his sugar wasn't behaving on its own. He knew who was bringing him his coffee and his evening vitamins. He wrote that he'd figured it out months before, and that he'd had a choice. He could confront them and probably end up dead faster, with no proof, leaving me to fight a charming widow and a slick stepson alone. Or he could play sick, gather every receipt and lab result and bank record he could get his trembling hands on, and load the gun for me. He chose the second. He chose to let it happen to him so that I'd have what I needed to win. "I'd rather lose 6 months and save your whole life," he wrote, "than save my 6 months and leave you defenseless. Be smarter than your anger. I love you more than the business, more than my own breath. Don't let them have either." My father let himself be murdered so I'd have a paper trail. I will be making peace with that until the day I die. There was a fourth thing, in a manila envelope tucked behind the rest, that wasn't from my dad. It was older. Newspaper clippings, obituaries, a printout of public records, all clearly assembled by the forensic accountant as part of the job, because the accountant, doing due diligence on the family, had pulled my stepmother's history. 3 husbands before my dad. A bank manager in Ohio, dead of a heart attack 2 years into the marriage. A man who owned car dealerships in Georgia, dead of diabetic complications 3 years in. A property developer in North Carolina, a stroke 18 months. Every one of them comfortable. Every one of them with a heart condition or diabetes. Every one of them leaving her a tidy sum and a moving van's worth of distance before she resurfaced under a slightly different last name in a new town. My dad was number 4. "Black widow," Birdie said softly, and for once she wasn't being funny. "She picks sick rich men on purpose. The medicine's the weapon. You can't even call it poison, half the time. Just too much of their own cure." We photographed everything twice. The next morning we took it to my dad's lawyer. He was an old man named Walt, who'd had the same office over the same shuttered pharmacy downtown since the 70s. With law books he clearly hadn't opened since cassette tapes. He read the will and the folder, and then he set them down very carefully and said, "Your father came to me 6 weeks ago, scared, told me he thought he was being hurt, but couldn't prove it yet. I told him to document everything and trust no one but you and his bookkeeper." His voice cracked. "I should have made him go to the police that day. I'll carry that." Then he picked up his phone, and the man knew everyone. Retired judges, a federal prosecutor he taught at the law school, and detective. The detective's name was Reyes. Mid-40s, no nonsense, the kind of tired that's earned. When Walt explained the medical angle, she didn't blink. She said very evenly that her own mother had been helped along by a caretaker for a small inheritance 15 years ago, that nobody had believed a younger Reyes until it was too late, and that she had spent her whole career making sure other people got believed. She'd actually had a flag on my stepmother already. An insurance investigator had quietly reported the pattern after husband number 3, and it had been sitting in a cold case file, waiting for a 4th body to make it warm. My dad was the 4th body. Reyes looked at me when she said it. "I'm sorry," she said, "but your father just turned a hunch into a case." The next 10 days were the strangest of my life. Birdie reconstructed the financial fraud down to the cent, finding shell companies my stepbrother thought he'd buried. Walt drafted motions to freeze the estate so nothing could be sold or transferred. Reyes got warrants, bank records, phone records, and the exhumation order I will never get the image of out of my head. The lab ran the panels my dad's body should have had months earlier. Insulin sky high, C-peptide on the floor. Exactly the fingerprint that doesn't exist in nature. Combined with the medical records and the prescription logs showing more insulin dispensed than any doctor had ordered, it was, in Reyes's words, a homicide with a signature. But she wanted them both cleanly, in their own words. "I can build manslaughter on the forensics," she said. "I want murder on a confession. Your stepbrother likes to talk, does he?" He did. He always had. My whole childhood, he had to be the cleverest one in any room. Had to explain the joke he'd just ruined, had to tell you how he'd outsmarted somebody. His arrogance was the one thing about him you could rely on. "Then we let him brag," Reyes said and looked at me. "But it has to come from you. He'll only let his guard down for someone he's already decided he beat. Can you play that?" I thought about my dad gripping my wrist. I thought about the pearls on the concrete. I said yes. So I called my stepbrother and I cried. And the awful thing is, I didn't have to fake the crying. I just had to aim it. I told him he'd won. I told him I couldn't fight anymore, that I was broke and scared, and I just wanted my mother's things and a little money to start over somewhere far away. I could hear him smiling through the phone, that wet, satisfied sound. He told me he'd be generous. 20,000 and a signature, and I'd never have to see him again. And then, because he could never resist twisting the knife, he added, "Should have taken the 10 when you had the chance. Could have saved yourself a lot of trouble." We agreed to meet at the flagship restaurant after closing 2 days out. He wanted witnesses, he said. He wanted it legal and final. We gave him witnesses. The afternoon of the meeting, I threw up twice. Birdie held my hair and told me I was my father's daughter, that I had his spine and his stubborn streak and his gift for letting people underestimate me. Reyes wired me herself, taping the mic under my collar, and stationed undercover officers as a cleaning crew and a couple lingering over a late dessert. Federal agents were in the kitchen and the walk-in. I walked into my dad's restaurant, a smell of hickory and vinegar in the walls, his photo still over the register, the one where he's laughing with his arm around Otis, and I sat down across from the man who killed him. He brought my stepmother, who set a bottle of champagne on the table, for after, and a sweating, twitchy man with a folder of papers who I recognized from a mugshot Reyes had shown me, a notary named Floyd, 3 convictions forgery, the man who'd witnessed the fake will, and he'd brought his girlfriend, a girl named Brandy, 23, who had clearly been told a very different story about who he was. She was filming herself for her followers in front of my dad's awards wall, narrating, "So this is like my boyfriend's family restaurant empire," and I had to physically stop myself from laughing, because somewhere in the kitchen, a federal agent was hearing it too. "Let's get this done," my stepbrother said, sliding the papers across the table. "Sign, get your check, go." I picked up the pen, then I set it down, like my hands were too shaky, which wasn't acting. "Before I do," I said, "I just need to understand what I'm signing away. My dad always said read everything." He rolled his eyes. He explained it slowly, like I was stupid, that I was giving up all claim to the business, the estate, everything, in exchange for 20,000 and silence. And then, because he could never just answer a question, he had to show off. He told me the company was already as good as sold, that he'd taken a lowball offer from a competitor because he needed the cash now, that he could have gotten almost double if he'd waited. But waiting wasn't an option. The wire caught every word. I asked as gently as I could manage. What about the employees' profit sharing? Dad promised them. Not my problem, he said and laughed. My stepmother laughed with him. So I stopped pretending. How did my dad really die? I asked. Heart, my stepmother said quickly. His heart, dear. You know that. You're a nurse. His heart, I repeated, not the extra insulin in his morning coffee. 6 months of it. The restaurant went so quiet I could hear the walking compressor kick on. Brandy lowered her phone. My stepbrother stood up slowly, and the purple was coming up his neck, the way it always did right before he hurt something. You don't know what you're talking about. Old man took his shot like a good boy this morning, I said, reading from memory off the text Reyes had pulled from his own records. Doubled it. Won't be much longer. You sent that to her 3 days before he died. You used your own phone. I looked at my stepmother. And you've done it 3 times before. A banker, a car dealer, a developer, all sick, all rich, all dead inside 3 years. He was just the 4th. Her mask came off then, finally, and what was underneath it was nothing at all, just a cold, flat calculation, and she said, You can't prove a thing. His body says otherwise, I said. They tested it. The insulin's there. The will you forged is sitting next to his real one in a lawyer's safe, and your notary, the sweaty man, was already easing toward the door, was in Memphis the day he supposedly witnessed it. There's a parking ticket, Brandy said in a tiny voice. Wait, I thought you owned all this. You said we were buying a boat. Baby, she's lying, my stepbrother started, and then a great many things happened at once. The cleaning crew turned out to have badges. The late dessert couple stood up. Detective Reyes came through the kitchen door with a line of federal agents behind her, reading names and charges, and my stepbrother did the dumbest possible thing and ran, and made it about 4 feet before an agent the size of a refrigerator put him through my dad's awards wall. The frame with the photo of him and Otis came down on his head. My stepmother didn't run. She was reaching for her phone to delete everything off it. But Birdie, who had insisted on being there to witness justice, reached across the table and knocked the phone clean out of her hand with that handbag, sweet as you please, and said, Oh my goodness. I'm so clumsy. I'm just an old woman. I thought it was a wasp. The notary got stuck climbing out the bathroom window and had to be retrieved by his belt. And Brandy, standing in the wreckage, looked down at the man being cuffed in the potting soil from my dad's ficus and screamed, I quit my job at the salon for you. I told everyone I was dating an entrepreneur. My mama said you had liar's eyes, and started hitting him with the designer purse he bought her with my father's stolen money, and 3 federal agents had to gently pry her off. I just stood there in the middle of it, under my dad's laughing photo, and I didn't feel triumphant. I felt scraped out and quiet. But I felt him there. I really did. The employees gathered in the lot outside, drawn by the lights, and when they saw my stepbrother led out in handcuffs, some of them cried. And they weren't sad tears. Otis, the pitmaster my dad carried through chemo, made it 3 steps toward the squad car before 2 younger cooks held him back, and he was saying, That man paid for my Renata's surgery. He gave me work when I had a record and nobody else would. And you. I'd never heard Otis raise his voice in my life. That was when I understood, really understood, how many people my dad had quietly kept afloat, and how casually my stepbrother had been willing to drown all of them for a quick sale. The trial was its own kind of theatre. My stepbrother went through 3 defense attorneys, each one quitting when they saw the size of the file. The financial crimes alone, wire fraud, tax evasion, looting an employee benefit fund, which is its own special federal sin, were enough to bury him. But the murder was the heart of it. The prosecutor, a calm woman who never once raised her voice, walked the jury through my stepmother's life like a museum tour. Husband 1, husband 2, husband 3, the same chart of dates and dollar amounts and causes of death, and then a photograph of my dad, and the lab numbers that don't occur in nature. A storage unit turned up that she'd kept under a fake name, and inside, neatly boxed, were keepsakes from each husband. Watches, wedding rings, and medical records annotated in her own handwriting where she'd studied each man's condition before she married him, like homework. My dad's were in there too. Increased Tuesday, one note said, switched the long acting. She'd planned his death like a recipe. Birdie testified. The prosecution probably should have warned her to dress for a courtroom, but I will be honest. Her testimony was the most devastating thing in the whole trial, precisely because she had no idea what she was saying. He told me the old man was dying anyway, she said, examining her nails. He said they were just helping him along so he wouldn't suffer, which I thought was really sweet of him, and then we'd have $12 million, so I didn't really ask questions. Was I supposed to ask questions? My last boyfriend said I asked too many questions. My stepbrother's face during the hour is the only thing about the trial I'd happily watch again. Then Walt took the stand and read parts of my dad's letter aloud, the part where he explained that he knew he was being killed and chose to gather proof rather than save himself, because saving himself meant leaving me alone against them. The judge called a recess. I watched a bailiff wipe his eyes in the hallway. The jury was out for 51 minutes. Guilty, every count. My stepbrother got 25 years on the federal charges and life for the murder, and when they read it he sat down hard like his legs had quit. My stepmother got life without parole, and she didn't flinch, just smiled that empty smile and said she'd appeal. She won't win. Floyd the notary took a deal and started naming everyone, which added years to my stepbrother's sentence and gave Reyes 3 more cases. Birdie, last I heard, has a true crime podcast. I want to tell you the rest, because the comments under stories like mine always ask whether it was worth it, whether anything good came out of it, and the answer is yes, more than I deserved. The company survived. With the theft stopped and the estate unfrozen, it turned out to be healthier than anyone thought, worth closer to $15 million once a real accountant. Birdie, who unretired again with great drama and a raise, straightened the books. The employees' profit sharing was restored with back interest. Otis cried at the table where they told him, and then immediately complained that the brisket was oversmoked, which is how I knew he was okay. There was one more letter from my dad, left with Walt to be opened after the verdict, and inside was a key to a safe deposit box at a bank 2 towns over that nobody else knew about. Bonds, a couple $1 million, set aside years ago when he first started to worry, in case they win the first round, with a note that said the second round is yours. And there was Dr. Vance Mateo, the hospitalist who'd ordered the lab that should have saved my dad's life and was ignored. He testified at the trial about the blood work. Afterward, he found me in the hallway and asked, very awkwardly for a man that smart, if I was eating, because I clearly wasn't. Coffee became dinner. Dinner became a habit. He is gentle in every place. My stepbrother was cruel, honest in every place that family lied, and the first time he stayed for breakfast he read the entire instruction manual for my coffee maker before he'd touch it, and I knew. We got married at the courthouse with Birdie and Walt as witnesses, and Otis catered, and there was no champagne for after because that particular bottle still sat in an evidence locker. I run Whitlock's now. I learned it from the floor up, the way my dad did, and it turns out I have his nose for it. We opened a 10th location last spring and named the catering arm after my mother. Some mornings I stand in the flagship before the lights come on, under the photo of my dad laughing with his arm around Otis. We rehung it, the frame scratched but the glass somehow never broke, and I tell him how the numbers came in. They thought I was soft. That was their whole plan, really. A grieving woman, a nurse, somebody who'd take the 10,000 and disappear rather than make a scene. My dad knew better. He spent the last 6 months of his life betting everything on the idea that the daughter he raised would be smarter than her anger and harder than her grief, and he was right, and I'd give it all back, every dollar, for one more Sunday of burned pancakes and a paperback in his back pocket. But since I can't, I do the next best thing. I take care of the people who take care of me. And I never, ever let anyone tell me what I'm too soft to survive. For a long time after the trial, I kept going back to one quiet fact. My father saw what was happening to him months before I did, and I'm the nurse. I had the training. I had his chart on my phone. And still it was Birdie, 71 years old, with reading glasses on a beaded chain, who said the word out loud first. That taught me something I needed to learn the hard way. Knowing how the world works isn't the same as being willing to look at it honestly when it's your own people doing the harm. The hardest sight to see clearly is the one standing in your own kitchen, pouring your father's coffee. My dad's whole plan rested on a single bet, and it wasn't a bet about money. He bet that I would be able to hold my anger in one hand and my thinking in the other without letting either one drop. If I'd stormed into the police station the afternoon my stepbrother hit me, screaming and bleeding and certain, with no will, no forensic file, no lab numbers, they'd have written me down as a grieving woman in a custody over an estate fight. And my stepmother would have moved 3 states away and married husband number 5 by Christmas. The reason any of them are behind bars is that I waited. I cried into the phone on purpose. I let a man who'd murdered my father believe he had beaten me because that was the only door he'd leave open. Cleverness without patience is just noise. My father knew that, and he was counting on me to know it too. But none of it would have meant a thing if I'd given up, and there were nights I wanted to. The night I sat in that dark driveway picking my mother's pearls off the concrete one by one, I genuinely did not believe I had another fight in me. What got me up off that pavement wasn't strength I was born with. It was a decision I had to make again every single morning to do the next small, unglamorous thing. Read one more page of the file. Make one more call. Show up to one more meeting wearing a wire while my hands shook. Endurance isn't a feeling, it's just refusing to quit on a schedule. And underneath all of it was the thing my dad actually left me, which was never really the company. It was a way of being in the world. Take care of the people who take care of you. He carried Otis through chemo. He paid for surgeries he never mentioned. When the money came back, the first thing I did was restore the employees' profit sharing because that was the only inheritance that ever mattered. The character you build quietly when no one's keeping score is the thing that decides what you do when everything's on fire. If you take anything from what happened to my family, let it be this. Look honestly, even when it hurts to look. Think before you swing, because the truth needs a foundation under it. And get back up on the days you're sure you can't, because the people who underestimate you are betting you won't. They thought I was soft. My father knew better. Be the one your father would have known better about.